Welcome to the Markets Happy Hour podcast, a weekly markets update for investors the world over. Each week we discuss inflation, geopolitics, interest rates, equity markets, and other asset classes. To try to answer the question, what does this mean for my investment portfolio? Let's dive in.
I'd love to move on to the 8 verbs of investing, but I thought this was intriguing because we have just come up with this disruptive effect of the altruist in the private wealth world, altruist with this tax planning software being about to disrupt our world. We saw that fall off a cliff. We saw banks affected. And I don't think people actually stop to say, well, how is AI actually going to affect the craft of investing? And what I thought was really intriguing is how you have broken down the crafts of investing into verbs, into what we do. And if you actually look at how it affects and is likely to affect every aspect of what we do, that I think is how you end up really parsing what the impact could be. So could you take us through this and how
Sure.
you came about this step-by-step approach?
So, the way it came about was a bit interesting. When I was at Lazard, began a data science group. And one of the things, and this was probably in 2015 or so, and the data science group was populated by individuals from non-financial fields, all very bright folks, much smarter than I will ever hope to become. And they were from different industries, and one of them was from neural imaging. His previous job, he was a PhD in physics, and he would take sensor data and recreate three-dimensional models of human brains for use in surgery. And so he came to ask me, what is it that you want us to do here? And I said, you're here to enhance our investment process. And he just said, I don't know what that is. And then I started hearing myself kind of reciting standard marketing PowerPoint jargon. And he said, can I just see the presentation from which you're quoting? And so what I ended up doing is I said, look, here is a whole file system filled with presentations about investment processes from different asset classes, and take a look at it. And of course, he automated that process. He concluded that investing seems to be mostly determined by what version of PowerPoint was available to the authors at the time of the investment process, which I thought was a bit too close to home. But ultimately, it led to this conversation about, well, what are you actually doing? Right? I mean, there are all kinds of funnels and arrows pointing to one another and things like this. What are you actually doing? And this ended up being a really long conversation before we kind of said, all right, what is investing? It starts with this observation, right? And you can look at this as a quantitative exercise or a data-driven exercise, or you could imagine a fundamental investor doing very much the same thing and then just using her own brain to kind of get there. So I think if you start with observation, that could be any of the data that the world has. Now that is exploding, and you've seen those charts just going parabolic in terms of what do we consider data. Data is not just tables, it's this conversation, it's every interaction that we can record. And from those observations, we form some kind of a belief, right? That is a prediction about the future in the end. And that belief then, in order to become more tangible, and this was a very controversial step, is we really have to categorize the belief into smaller buckets. It's one thing to say, well, I think developing economies are going to grow faster than developed economies. But until you kind of untangle that mess and say, well, this is why, or these are the 3 areas, I think. I mean, the rule of threes has a good origin story in investing as well. So I think in categorization, you have to take a broader topic and parse it into smaller subtopics. And that is actually when a lot of the communication starts to come alive. It's typically when I think that the most humans begin to understand things when they see it broken down, at least into one level. If you get too fine, it becomes a bit confusing. And so suppose you might have 3 or 4 categories, then you get into the more day-to-day process of investing. Qualify is a step in which you'd say, what is every possible thing I can do now? What am I allowed? What am I legally permitted in the case of an investment? What am I permitted to invest? This could be something as simple as screening, but a lot of the historical screening exercises have really relied on shortcuts because of that mass production concept, right? We say, okay, well, I'm only going to invest in large caps in the US or something like that, or equities or whatever it might be. So that's another area where you're seeing, I think, quite a bit of work done. And then the meat of it is analyzing. If I'm going to now take everything I can do and reduce it, in some way, I am going to have to analyze, typically using multiple modes of research, every one of the choices, right? Now, in quantitative investing, everything has to flow through the funnel, as they say. In fundamental investing, a lot of people simply just ignore many of the choices that are available. But ultimately, so you might look at it, so maybe a research analyst goes to visit the company and they reach some conclusions.